So today we have joining us again Vijay Prashad. He is an Indian historian, editor, and journalist. He is a writing fellow and chief correspondent at Globetrotter. He is the chief editor of Leftward Books and the director of Tricontinental Institute for Social Research. He is a senior non-resident fellow at Changyang Institute for Financial Studies, Renmin University of China. And he's written more than 20 books, including The Darker Nations and The Poorer Nations. And his latest book is Washington Bullets, with an introduction by Evo Morales Aima. So without any further ado, I'm bringing in Vijay Prashad. Hello, welcome.
Hi, it's great to be with you. Thanks a lot.
I want to talk to you, of course, about Russia and Ukraine, but I also want to talk to you about the anniversaries of, we have the 19-year-old anniversary of the Iraq War. We also have the 10-year anniversary of the NATO attacks on Libya. Those are two things you covered. And I think it's important for people to know why these wars are relevant, both in the general context, but what these wars teach us about the invasion today of Ukraine, and more perhaps significantly about the media's coverage of said invasion. I know, big question.
Well,
big questions,
Katie,
but
it's a superb way to start. It is the anniversary of the illegal U.S. war on Iraq. Again, illegal, it's a pretty strong word, but it's not my word. It's the word used by the United Nations Secretary General in 2004. Kofi Annan went on BBC a year after the United States began to destroy Iraq and called it an illegal war. That's, I think, a pretty strong judgment. Biden has been dancing around this phrase, war criminal, using this phrase to describe Mr. Putin. Now, maybe it's a correct phrase. Let's leave that aside. But given that the UN Secretary General called the war against Iraq an illegal war, started in March 2003, a war of aggression, therefore, there are culpabilities. If you're going to say something, you're the head of the United Nations. If you're going to say something like, hey, listen, this is an illegal war, it's a war of aggression. By the way, we now trigger the Nuremberg question, Nuremberg being the trials of the German leadership for pursuing a war of aggression in Europe in 1939, first against Czechoslovakia and Austria and so on. If you're going to say war of aggression, illegal war, somebody should have been tried for war crimes. That's axiomatic. It follows directly, which means that George Bush and his entire clique were in fact war criminals. I was actually quite surprised to watch, I believe it was a clip from MSNBC, where Condoleezza Rice, a name now less familiar to many people, she was the National Security Advisor for George W. Bush during the war on Iraq, the illegal war. Condoleezza Rice, by the way, has an oil tanker named after her called the Condoleezza Rice. That's the proximity between the Bush administration and oil companies. Condoleezza Rice was told by the host, they were talking about the Russian attack on Ukraine, where they said, this kind of thing has never happened. Since 1945, no nuclear power country has invaded another country. And I'm thinking, good God, you're actually saying this is fake news, because forget all the other attacks by the United States. Forget all of them. Forget Panama. Forget every other attack that the United States conducted. But Iraq, 2003, how could you forget that? And Condoleezza Rice sitting across from you is the one who was in the decision making for that war. And yet on US television today, fake news gets by. Iraq war elided. And the last thing I want to say about this, Katie, because I think it is really important. You mentioned media coverage of this war. We're basically living in an international division of humanity. Where journalists, self-respecting journalists from ABC News and so on, self-respecting journalists can say things like, I'm shocked that there's a war in Europe, blonde hair, blue eyes, things like that, where borders open directly and, there's like parliamentary discussions about got to let every Ukrainian in, but screw the Syrians, screw the Iraqis, screw the Afghans, screw the Yemenis, screw them all. That's an international division of humanity. Certain people are human, Others are basically animals, and you get to bomb them, and it's not a war. United States didn't prosecute a war in Iraq because that's not a war against human beings. This is a war because it's against people who have blonde hair and blue eyes. And I mean, that actually drives me nuts. Forget all the kind of attacks on RT and all of that. That's to be expected, because there's a shallowness in the Western institutions. They are extraordinarily shallow with their ideas of press freedom and things. I don't have respect for them in terms of these values. But on this, I mean, our fellow reporters going on air, saying things like, I shouldn't say this, but this is in Europe. I mean, I'm thinking, have you lost your mind? You were there in Baghdad. Do you think Baghdad deserves to be bombed and the capital of Ukraine doesn't deserve to be bombed? I mean, I think neither deserve to be bombed, just for the record, in case anybody's checking. I believe neither deserve to be bombed. But is that what you're saying when you say, for God's sake, a European city? That, to me, Katie, that's the heart of this question with Ukraine. Forget NATO expansion. This war demonstrates that the Western consciousness lives in the sewer. That's what this war demonstrates to me.
Yeah, and it was actually Condoleezza Rice appeared on, it was Fox News, but to be fair, they're so indistinguishable when it comes to coverage of this issue. You can't really tell which network you're watching. And it was really stunning to watch Condoleezza Rice condemn what she described as the invasion of a sovereign country. It's like, are you just upset because someone else is doing it and you wanted to have the monopoly on that? Like, do you feel threatened?
Well, and I have argued that when you invade a sovereign nation, that is a war crime. I mean, I think we're at just a real basic point there.
Well, I'd agree. It is certainly against every principle of international law and international order, and that's why throwing the book at them now in terms of economic sanctions and punishments is also a part of it, and I think the world is there.
And can you talk about Libya? Because that's something that I think most Americans really, with Iraq, there were American boots on the ground. A lot of Americans aren't aware at all of what happened in Libya and what the role of NATO was and the United States.
Well, in August of this year, I'm really happy to let you know that Noam Chomsky and I are going to release a book called The Withdrawal. Noam is an incredible man. We've been in a friendship for about 30 years. Began by me writing him a letter, from India. And he responded to me. And I have the hard copy letters, his typed responses, from the 1990s. And we corresponded right through, became friends. I'm a Marxist. Noam is a kind of an anarchist, and we don't share everything. And why should we? But we have a deep friendship and an understanding about the nature of the aggression of countries like the United States. A deep connection here. As he says, you go and report these things from the front line, and I think about them in my office. But in a way, there's a real synergy that's there. This book is really quite interesting because we emphasize the three withdrawals of Afghanistan, Iraq, and Libya. And the Libya case is so important, not only because, I have a long history with Libya. I went there as a little child in 1974 with my father. In fact, it was magical, Katie. We drove from Alexandria, Egypt, across past Tobruk. And in 1974, there were still German tanks that had been destroyed in World War II sitting in the battlefields of Tobruk and El Alamein and so on. It was magic for a little boy, and of course, the desert and so on. And as you cross the border, there was an enormous picture of Muammar Gaddafi. He had just been the head of government 5 years. The coup was in 1969. He was a beautiful man, in his youth. Seriously, like a pin-up boy, in a way. And so I've had a long history with Libya, been there a number of times and so on. And in 2011, what was done to Libya is a crime, a crime of the greatest magnitude. Yes, there were protests that broke out in Benghazi and others. In fact, I have friends who went out and protest, lawyers, human rights people, and so on. In 2011, there was no evidence in February 2011 that there was going to be a massacre or anything like that. the battalion, the army in Benghazi, in the eastern sector of Libya, defected to the rebels. It was basically a civil war, actually. There should have been a peace process. Gaddafi was, in fact, willing to have a ceasefire and so on. The head guy in Benghazi was Mahmoud Jibril, who was the financial advisor of at the time Emir of Qatar's wife. He was her financial advisor. He came in as like the great hero, democratic hero. United States and France basically were backing the Benghazi rebellion fully, saying that they are going to get genocide against by Gaddafi and so on. Um, I remember asking at the United Nations in early March of 2011, how do you know what's happening on the ground? And UN people were saying, look, we don't have anybody on the ground there, but we're following press reports. Well, which press? This is important. Which press? Well, not CNN, not MSNBC, not Fox. And as you say, they're pretty interchangeable, but none of them were on the ground. What were they following? They were following largely a newspaper called Al Arabiya. Now, Al Arabi, where is Al Arabi from? It's from Saudi Arabia. Well, who owns it? The royal family. They were essentially following the royal family's diktat regarding Libya. And, the king of Saudi Arabia hated Gaddafi. Gaddafi used to go into these meetings and say to him, "You're a dog of the Americans." That's how Gaddafi spoke. This was a vendetta. And NATO came in, getting a UN Security Council resolution, to the eternal shame of countries like China and Russia, who allowed the resolution to go through. They didn't veto it. They allowed it to go through. It is a serious question that the Russians and Chinese need to ask. Why did they allow that to go through? They allowed it to go through. Other countries abstained in that vote because they believed it was just going to be a quote unquote no-fly zone. It's very instructive, Katie, for now, when Zelensky is calling for a no-fly zone. They said it's going to be a no-fly zone. But actually, we know it wasn't. And Noam and I write about this because we know it wasn't, because the African Union, while the no-fly zone was being prosecuted, quote unquote, I'll come to that, the African Union under Jacob Zuma arrived in Benghazi. Gaddafi said, "I'm ready for a ceasefire." Then they went in Tripoli. Then they went to Benghazi, met Jibril and others, and they said, "No ceasefire." Why? Because NATO's airplanes were basically the air force of the rebellion. They were bombing Tripoli. They destroyed many parts of the country. And then after the war, they refused to collaborate with the UN for an investigation about, where they bombed and so on. Refused. Peter Olson, the lawyer of NATO, told the United Nations, told Security Council that NATO does not commit war crimes. Only barbarians commit war crimes, not NATO. So this Libya war is very instructive. The West destroyed Libya, created, a complete chaos in that country, which exists till today, 2011 till now, that's 11 years later, still complete chaos. Most people, don't know the level of chaos in that country today. Still offline, as it were, for the construction of institutions, and no investigation of NATO, none allowed, because NATO refuses, and nobody has the authority to tell NATO, no, we need to investigate you. None at all. And all because what? A no-fly zone. Zelensky wants a no-fly zone. What he really wants is for the Western Air Force, the NATO Air Force, to become the Air Force of Ukraine. That's what they really want. And that's what is going to lead us into a major confrontation. And that's why a no-fly zone is really out of the question. Even Biden and so on are wary of the no-fly zone in this case, because you don't want to see, look, even in Syria, the United States and Russia very carefully divided up where their air forces could fly so that there would be no accidental clash. If one of the other country brings down a plane, it's mayhem. We don't know what's going to happen. It's the jaws of hell beyond belief.